Hi, welcome to the Pursuit of Truth. So it's, I think, day 6 of the Ukrainian invasion by Russia. And I'm just going to start off by saying that obviously I'm against war. I'm against this particular war because as what I've seen or what's been reported to me, and I can only take that as well, I hope that Sky News and BBC News, etc., have been telling the truth about the situation there. I know it's a lot more complicated than what they're saying, but they are an innocent people and they're a sovereign country based in the system, and they've been invaded by Russia for, I can't see any real reason. Um, so I'm against war in general because I don't like the idea of innocent people being brainwashed to go and shoot other innocent people. The idea of military, I don't like that. The brainwashing of individuals to fight while their leaders sit in their bunkers. But yeah, just on that basis, just in case, when you hear the rest of this, you think, oh, he's pro-Russian, just because I'm talking about things I hear to do with. Today I heard on Sky News they're talking about Ofcom, 15 investigations into Russia today. I did see a bit of it, like I said. I didn't see it to be that biased. Obviously, there was a little bit of a slant towards Russia, but it wasn't. I was expecting a lot more because I thought it was going to be like a Russian actual channel, whereas it looks like it's filmed in London, but with presenters from the UK. So, and I've already talked about that, and journalists and bias and that kind of thing. But they were talking about they're not being impartial. That's when they're being investigated. Impartial. This description of that NCBI is impartiality can take to mean that coverage should be unbiased, balanced, objective, open-minded, and avoid favouring one side over another. That's Cushion 2011. And so I was wondering, so are Ofcom considering that the BBC and Sky News are being impartial? I don't know whether human beings can be impartial because we're brought up in this divided world where East and West and etc. and different cultures and the division of people by colour of skin, and therefore we have groups, and then that when we're brought up, all those things get in our minds and form our way of seeing the world, which may not be truthful, but it's our personal way of seeing the world. And obviously the Russia's always demonized here, and I suspect in Russia the West is demonized, same with Iran, North Korea and things like that. So therefore, can you be impartial because you've got all those bits in your mind, all those films you've seen, all those bits of news or propaganda from both sides? And like there's a famous saying, isn't it? The first casualty of war is truth. And so yeah, maybe Russia today are pro-Russian, obviously, and if they're taken off because of impartiality, well, I hope that Ofcom are going to actually then look at BBC and Sky News and UK multimedia to see whether they're being impartial or not, because they're obviously not. They're pro Ukraine or pro the West, pro Europe, obviously. Even during the Iraq and Afghanistan war, where Kofi Annan, although he afterwards said it was an illegal war, most people knew it was an illegal war. It was a misuse of UN resolutions, the lies of weapons of mass destruction. Well, we since know because of the whistleblower, whose name I've forgotten, who released the documents, WikiLeaks, Assange, yeah. The WikiLeaks documents showed the war crimes there. So what I'm saying is the BBC and Sky News, if you listen to the words they use when they talk about things, when they talk about Putin, when they talk about Russia, they're not the same kinds of words they use when they talk about Biden or even Trump, who's maybe more comparable, or Boris Johnson. The language that's used, that shows the impartiality, the they're not looking at this from both sides and trying to get a balanced view, because that's impossible to do, especially in a war. If you're going to say one's an aggressor and one's not, in your view, how can you be impartial? Because you're already admitting this one's an aggressor and this one's not. And so how could you be impartial? Because the truth is this one's an aggressor. So you have to have a slant. I guess that's how they would argue it. But of course, from Russia's point of view, that would be flipped, because they don't see themselves as the aggressor. They see themselves as freeing the Ukraine from the far right, which don't get considering Zelensky is Jewish, of Jewish heritage. I don't know. It's just, I don't know. See what Ofcom says, but it just, the thing I don't like about it, and this is to do with the hypocrisy of how they talk about Russia. Yeah, I know Putin is crazy and he's invading and he's doing something that's wrong. A lot of people, though, are questioning, whether this is a bit more of a distraction from other things to do with COVID, because if you've noticed, Sky News, they're not covering the amounts of infection or deaths anymore at all, even though they could just write it on the bottom. It's no longer important. And some people are talking about this, some WHO UN resolution that's going to be signed, I think it's today, on the 1st of March. I don't know really what that's all about. Probably given control, and they're worried about things to do with personal rights. I saw people on my Facebook were putting those about that, but we already know, the system itself is easily controllable by the 1%, those people, power, money, control. So I don't know. We already know that. So just giving another example of that. But yeah, the thing is, like, when I've been watching the war, it's been difficult because they've all been talking about, and I've never heard them say this before, about verifying the footage. Is that because we live in an age now where it's impossible to know, whether someone's, using Photoshop or whatever? Is it because, what we're seeing, it doesn't seem much like a war, not compared to what we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan with the big bombs. But then I was thinking, was that because it's a different kind of invasion? With Putin, he wants to take over Ukraine, and blowing it up would mean you have to pay for it, and he wants them to join him. So that made me think, well, wait a minute then. So when the West bombed Iraq and Afghanistan and blew it up and made it look like a disaster zone, what did that say about the West? Well, that was because they didn't ever want to live there. They didn't want to take it over. They just wanted to win a war. And so really that shows the West, how they treated those people in Iraq and Afghanistan, compared to, I'm not trying to sort of praise Putin or anything like that before you start misaligning what I'm saying. What I'm trying to show is that the West, Russia, all these premiers, presidents, prime ministers, they're all, well, not all as bad as each other, but they all, in war, they seem to all be as bad as each other, We know what happened when they're talking about civilian populations being targeted. We know in the Second World War, I was taught this in history, about how Winston Churchill was one of the first, was the first before Hitler to hit residential areas so that they had time to rebuild their planes, because they lost time, and then that meant that London got civilian areas got bombed in afterwards. So, mustard gas was used by Churchill. The Vietnam War, there were lots of war crimes that were committed there. There were lots of war crimes that Assange has brought up that were committed in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I don't see, anyone, Nixon or I've forgotten his name after Kennedy, or Bush or Blair standing for war crimes, whereas they're already talking about Putin standing for war crimes. And yeah, any warmonger, anyone who abuses, who kills women and children, a war should be against military versus military. But then, of course, that's where now it's difficult in Ukraine, because they're asking their public to make Molotov cocktails. And I guess Russia's seeing that as human shields. But any abuses, war, full stop, it should only be done in, the only way I can see it as possibly being okay for me to take is if it was done in defence. you know. So, like, if they're an innocent people and they're being invaded, then yes, you have to fight back. No one should just let go. And that's where there's a lot of debate now about the West is in action when they know they're being told and they're saying that war crimes being committed. But this is shadows really of the Second World War. Britain and the West knew about what was happening in the concentration camps, but never told the people, and let it continue until, well, I suppose let it continue is probably a bit harsh, but they definitely knew about it. But yeah, so, and like people are drawing these shadows of Munich and stuff, because that film was out recently about, Chamberlain and, getting the peace and being told they're not going to invade, and then Hitler did invade, and that was allowed to happen. Chamberlain appeased him by letting him have a bit of land. This is the same as we're now doing, letting them have Ukraine, letting them have Crimea, Russia, and now the worry is if he moves on. If Chamberlain had maybe been more forceful or attacked Hitler at that time, but before the Peace of Weimar of peace, then maybe it would have stopped him. Is this the same mistake we're going to be making? But yeah, definitely there's a lot of bias. Well, obviously there's always going to be bias in war, isn't it? But to find the truth of this is very difficult because we're relying on journalists who've been brought up in countries where they've been told Russia's bad, China's bad. If you gave people a poll to do, who's the good guys, who's the bad guys, what the results would be. And that may not be based on any real truth. That's based on how we've been brought up, how movies have shown us, how the news, all news is propaganda in some sense, because it's impossible for people to be independent or impartial, despite all these independent and impartial investigations that we're meant to be having that always are whitewashes. The things, no one says this, the journalists don't say this because I guess they're too afraid of people saying, oh, you're pro-Russian, or how could you say that in a time of war? When it's a journalist's job to actually get to the truth. But that seems like that has been lost a long time ago with the news media, because it's all about shock jockeying, all about, breaking news, all about fear, all about, like with the nuclear thing, he never said nuclear, said deterrent, and they weren't talking about nuclear weapons in the sense of launch them into the West. They were talking about the sort of nuclear weapons they have on the ground that are like not proper nuclear weapons but have some nuclear capacity. They've never been used, and if they were used, that probably would prompt NATO or the West to have a reaction. But I guess it's going to look bad on the West because they're going to say, well, wait a minute, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, not a NATO country, you were ready to go to the first Iraq war and defend them. But when these people that you're saying yourself are being, there's war crimes being committed, civilian targets being children, but you're not doing anything because you're too afraid of having to fight or escalating into a bigger war. If it was a small country, they would have been in. If it was an oil country and a small country, they would have been in. But because it's an equal side. I don't know, we're in very dangerous times, that's all I can see. Dangerous times in truth, dangerous times in impossible wars. And the people who are going to suffer aren't the big leaders like Putin, is the little people everywhere in Russia and Ukraine, as usual. And we carry on that system. Take care, things, God bless, and peace.